So, hello everybody. My name is Bertrand de Montmollin. I will try to share my screen and just tell me if it works or not. Okay. Does it work?
Yep, that's good. Yep.
Yes.
So, still?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So I guess everybody is can see the presentation. So the goal of this presentation is to give you some introduction words and notions about the plant K biodiversity areas. It's a rather complicated process, and I guess it will be difficult for you to follow and everything. You may have some question to raise at the end of the session, and probably after testing that, if you intend to test that, we could organize another session or direct question by email to answer if you have more questions or something to understand. So my presentation first is some words about the KBA Global Program, and after more in detail, the KBA Global Standards and criteria with a special focus on plants, because all of you are botanists or interested in plant KBA. So in conservation, we talk about three main conservation targets: species, habitats, and ecosystem services. And it is what conservation practitioners aim to use to protect their intrinsic value as well for their benefits. We have had a global approach to assess the species which has been developed, tested, and now recognized globally as a benchmark for species. This is the IUCN Red List categories and criteria that probably most of you know already. But there hasn't been much attention focused on sites, nor a globally recognized standard approach to identify sites for conservation. Instead, there have been many different ways of prioritizing areas of the Earth which have been proposed at very different scales, from hotspots, so very large areas and ecoregion, down to site scale, such as IBA, important birds areas, and IPA, important plant areas, and some others. So it's important to have sites that are manageable to conserve the species and the ecosystem. During the IUCN World Conservation Congress in 2004, the importance of having a unifying framework for identifying important sites across the globe that consider of all of biodiversity was recognized. One of the two objectives of the IUCN WCPA, so the World Protected Area Group, and the SSC, Species Survival Commission, they formed a joint task to lead this consultation process to develop the IUCN KBA standard. This large consultation process led to the publishing of a global standard for the identification of K biodiversity areas in 2016, so rather recently, which describes the standards and criteria to identify KBAs. You can probably, we will send you the presentation afterwards, and you can follow the links to download all the documents I'm presenting to you this afternoon. IUCN is associated with other partners inside the so-called KBA partnership, what was established in 2016, and its aim was to map, monitor, and conserve the most important sites for biodiversity on Earth. That doesn't mean that it's the only site that needs conservation, but the most important sites. The commitment of this KBA partnership is leading and coordinating the identification and documentation of KBAs. So as you can see, there are almost 10 partners: BirdLife, IUCN, Conservation International, CEPF, of course, the GEF, Global Wildlife Conservation, NatureServe, Rainforest Trust, WWF, and WCS. It was also recognized that BirdLife International will map the most important site on Earth on a database for the partnerships. It already exists some KBAs that were already identified in the past, especially by BirdLife International, so the important bird areas. As you can see in this diagram, most of them, or 2/3 of them, are birds important plant areas, but there are also mammals, important areas, also some for plants in greens in the diagram, but not so many. What are the criteria? I will give you first an overview of all the criteria, and after go more in depth in the most meaningful criteria for plants. So there are 5 high criteria. So threatened biodiversity, it's A. B, geographically restricted biodiversity. C, ecological integrity. D, biological processes. And E, irreplaceability through quantitative analysis. These are the 5 main criteria. And to design or delineate a KBA, you have to meet one of these 5 group of criteria. So that means that you don't have to meet all of them, but one of them or one of the group is sufficient. Let's go a bit more in depth through these 5 high criteria. The first one is the threatened biodiversity. Each criterion and sub-criterion has quantitative thresholds to ensure that KBA identification is objective, transparent, and repeatable. So it's not an expert choice, but it has to be quantitative for 2 reasons. So the first is kind of objectivity, and also if we repeat the assessment 10 years later or 20 years later, we have to measure if progresses have been accomplished, if the KBA has to be the same or larger or smaller. So inside this A criterion, you have 2 sub-criterion: the threatened species, so it's related to the IUCN Red List, and the threatened ecosystem type. For the threatened species, You have 5 subcategories: A, B, C, D, and E. And for each of them, you have a quantitative approach. I will go afterwards more in depth on that. And to meet the A criteria, threatened biodiversity, you have to meet one of the sub-criterion or sub-sub-criterion, okay? The second one, criterion B, is geographically restricted area. Geographically restricted species. And you have sub-criterion, one on individual species, B2 on co-occurring species, B3 assemblage, and B4 ecosystem types. The third main criterion is ecological integrity. Ecological integrity means a site which is one of the maximum 2 per ecoregion, characterized by wholly intact ecological communities comprising the composition and abundance of native species and their interaction. There are 2 key ideas behind that. There are sites with minimal impacts by humans and intact fauna and flora. For the Mediterranean region, we have very, very, very few sites that have minimal impacts by humans, and because, as you all know, most of them are really impacted by human activities since a very, very long time. The third main criteria is biological processes. This criterion is not very useful for flora. It's mostly used for fauna, especially for birds and mammals, because this takes into account the fact that many species are migratory, so they don't breed at the same place where they have the winter time, etc., etc. So as plants are usually all their life cycle at the same site or the same place, we don't use them for plant KBA. And the last one is a very complicated one, is irreplaceability through quantitative analysis. The idea is to have sites that have many threatened and rare species, and not only in a taxonomic group, for instance plants, but also for other groups like reptiles, amphibians, birds, mammals, or invertebrates, and so on. So these are the 5 main criterion, and after we will go more in depth in 2 or 3 of them, because they are the most useful for plants. In the slides, when it's very useful for plants, it's highlighted in green. You can find all the information, the detailed information in a guide, the guidelines for KBA standard that you can download, or we can send it to you after the presentation. So let's go on the species criteria, and the main criterion is threatened species and E1 threatened species. For that, you have to meet one of the 5 sub-criterion which are listed here. So if we start with A1A, the site must have more than or equal or more than 0.5% of the global population size and more than 5 reproductive units of a species that is critically endangered or endangered. according to the IUCN species red list. After, you can have E1b, so 1% of more of global population, etc., of a vulnerable species, or E1c, more than 0.1% of global population size of a species listed as critically endangered due only to past and current decline, as defined in the IUCN Red List guidelines. So, if the species is not recently or currently declining, it's 0.5%. If it is declining, it's 0.1%. Okay, this takes into account the risk of extension. The same for A1D, 0.2% of a global population size or 10 reproductive units, referred to past or current decline for vulnerable species. And the last one, the sites have effectively the entire population size of a species critically endangered or endangered. And to measure that, we have to apply some parameters. The number of individuals, so-called the mature individuals, but for plants, usually all plants are quickly mature, with exceptions of trees, probably. The area of occupancy, I will explain you later what it is exactly. The extent of suitable habitat for the species, the range, the number of localities, and distinct genetic diversity. This refers to subspecies or varieties. Normally, when we talk of species, it's really species, not subspecies or variety. It's the same for the red list of threatened species. So that's the main definition for criterion E1, threatened species. Another important species threshold and criterion is individually geographically restricted species. It's what we usually call restricted range endemic species. And the criterion is simple, and it's the most commonly used in plant KBA identification, because as you know, in many Mediterranean countries, especially in North Africa and Near East, there are very few, or rather few, species that are red listed in the global IUCN red list. So we can apply this B1 criterion. So the site must have over 10% of the global population size and more than 10 reproductive units of any species. So every site you have in your country or that has at least 10% of the global population, not the population of the country, but the global population of a species, it can be designed as a plant KBA, as a KBA. And the assessment parameters are exactly the same as in the previous criterion. So the number of individuals, the area of occupancy, extent of suitable habitats, the range, number of localities, and this question of genetic diversity. So this B1 is the main criterion you will have to use, but don't forget that it addresses the global range of the species, not only the range within your country or your region. It's really for restricted range endemics. Some definition to that. So the global population is the estimate of the global population of the species throughout its current range. So it's exactly what I said before. So the whole range of the species. The site population, it's a population inside the site you consider as a potential KBA, so estimate of site population of a species present at a site, and the reproductive unit. This notion is more used for animals. It is the minimum number and combination of mature individuals necessary to trigger a successful reproductive event at a site. So, as said, it's not very relevant for plants. You have a whole set of other definitions, of other important definitions in the guidelines I mentioned before. The assessment parameters, when we talk about number of mature individuals, it's the number of individuals known, estimated, or inferred to be capable of reproduction. Usually for plants, it's all the plants. Area-based measure, I will show you a map just next slide. It's based on the area of occupancy, of the extent of suitable habitats, if we don't know exactly the area of occupancy, the range, and the number of localities. The distinct genetic diversity, the density of mature individuals, and the relative abundance of mature individuals. Botanists usually don't use these three last parameters. The question of the area-based parameters is shown on this map. What you have in green is the area of occupancy, and this shows you the different scales you have to take into account to map the range of a species inside a KBA, or to delineate the KBA. So there are the known localities, vagrant localities. Vagrant localities, they are localities where the species sometimes occur. It's more used for animals and more rarely for plants. Inferred occurrences, it's when we think that the species could be there. Projected occurrences is more or less the same. Extent of occurrence, it's more restricted. There are patches, dots where the species really exist, and this EOO is used for the red list species assessment. The area of habitats, all the habitats that are suitable for this species, and all that is the area of occupancy. The hierarchy of assessment parameters. Ideally, we have to use mature individuals, and for plants it's not so relevant, because most of the plants are mature the same year of their growth, except for trees or or monocarpic plants, so plants that reproduce every 12 or 15 or 20 years. The proposer, so you are encouraged to provide information on all assessment parameters for which reliable data are available at global and site level. So if you meet one criterion, it's good, but if you have information on the other criterion, it's better. Also for the question of reassessment, and after to combine your assessment for some species with assessment of colleagues, for instance, colleagues who work on mammals or on birds or reptiles, to delineate a global KBA and not only a plant KBA. Just the KBA, normally they refer to all the species. In a country, it's a KBA. It's not a plant KBA. But for us, botanists, and inside the CEPF process, we first design plant KBA, and after we will go through the process afterwards. We will make a global KBA, so with the plant KBA, the bird KBA, etc. When different assessment parameters point to different conclusions, proposers should use the best available information and justify that choice. Information is not always up to date and of the best quality. So you are supposed to take into account the best information and the last one to propose your plant KBA. If equally good data are available on more than one parameter, we normally use the area-based parameter in this order. So the area of occupancy, second, the extent of suitable habitats, after the range, and after the localities. All this KBA process is really based on the IUCN red list of threatened species. Probably most of you know this this process, and it is very important to understand it because the criteria are more or less the same. And secondly, if you use E1 criterion, so threatened biodiversity, the species you use must be in the IUCN Global Red List. So often the first step is to make an IUCN Red List assessment to define the threat level of the species you consider to delineate your plant KBA. Probably you all already worked with that, and you have a very brief summary of all the criteria for species assessments. So here there are the three most threatened, so critically endangered, and vulnerable. And you can see that many of these criteria are more or less common with the KBA criteria. The question of the extent of occurrence, the area of occupancy, the population, the number of mature individuals, etc., etc. So there is a strong link between the KBA criteria and the red list of species criteria. So how do we apply this criteria for multiple species? Because usually in one site or a site you suppose that it could be a plant KBA, you have several species that you consider that could be threatened or worse to be protected in the plant KBA. So we have different means to take into account the fact that some sites have several threatened or important plants. So the criterion B2, I will go more in depth afterward, is co-occurring geographically restricted species, or B3, geographically restricted assemblage. If we go more in depth in B2, co-occurring geographically restricted species, the criterion B2 means that 1% of the global population size of each of a number of restricted range species in a taxonomic group, so more than 2 species or 0.02% of the total number of species in the taxonomic group, whichever is larger. This criterion is very rarely used for plants because the definition of taxonomic group is not clear in the plant world. For other groups like invertebrates, you can rather easily take a family which is more homogeneous than for plants. Moreover, you know that taxonomy, especially at the genus or family level in the plant world, is changing. So the definition of taxonomic groups in botany, in the plant world, is not clear yet. The KBA definition of a taxonomic group is everything above the genus level. So, but we have subfamilies, families, and order, and so on, and this is not very easy to manage. So, for at the moment, my advice would be not to use, or preferably not to use this criterion. The criterion B2. It's also difficult to apply for plants. It's co-occurring restricted species. The definition is for restricted range. They are species that have a global range size less than or equal to the 25th percentile of range size distribution in a taxonomic group. Again, this is a famous taxonomic group within which all species have been mapped globally up to a maximum of 50,000 square kilometers. So it looks very complicated. It doesn't only look very complicated, it's very complicated to apply. So our advice is not to begin with that kind of criteria, so B1 or B2. Another criterion under the B main criterion is geographically restricted assemblage with 3 sub-criterion. B3A means 0.5% of global population size of each of a number of eco-region restricted species in a taxonomic group. So this is a bit more interesting because it refers to the ecoregion. The Mediterranean is an ecoregion. So you can consider species that are endemic to the Mediterranean. There are many Mediterranean endemic, but so it can refine a bit your choice. But here also it's a bit difficult, and after you have B3B, 5 reproductive unit or 5 bioregion restricted species, and B3C site, if the site is part of the globally most important 5% of occupied habitat for more than 5 species in the taxonomic group. Here also it's difficult to apply because we don't have many information on the global range of many species in the Mediterranean, so you have to consider the whole range of a species, which is sometimes difficult. After we have the ecosystem species criteria, so it's not only related to plants, but it can be used, but with some limitation. I will go into 3 criterion: A2 threatened ecosystem types, B4 geographically restricted ecosystem types, and C ecological integrity. Ecosystem level. A clear definition of what an ecosystem is doesn't really exist, and it's very difficult to compare the level of ecosystem between different regions or even different countries, because mostly these ecosystem descriptions are based on on plants, but also on landscape, on plants and habitats. And phytosociology is very often different from country to country. Some countries use one system, another country use another system, so comparison is very difficult. But the main definition of what an ecosystem type, so you have all the levels from L1 to L6, realm, biome, functional group, biogeographic functional type, and the ecosystem type, which is what we refer to in this KBA process. Ecosystem type is a complex of organisms, their interactions and physical environment, and distributed within a landscape or seascape or group of related landscape. Ecosystem type are discriminated bottom up explicitly by their composition and serve as operational units of assessment for the global red list of ecosystem. There we refer to the red list of ecosystem. And IUCN is trying since many years to make a red list of threatened ecosystem. Here are the definition of this threatened ecosystem, but until now, very few regions or countries have a red list of ecosystem and a globally accepted red list of ecosystem. Some countries have one, but the name of the ecosystem or the definition of the ecosystem is usually not globally approved. So it is sound for their country, but maybe it's not globally sound. And IUCN is now pushing forward to really try to have a global red list of ecosystem in order to apply them in particular for the delineation and definition of the KBA, because this could be very, very important. So we have this criterion A through, threatened ecosystem, with two sub-criterion. A to 1, 5% or more of the global extent of a globally critically endangered or endangered ecosystem type. That means that if your site or your proposed KBA site has at least 5% of one ecosystem type, this qualify for KBA. And A to B is more or less the same, but 10% of the global extent for a globally vulnerable ecosystem type. This could be very useful and easy to define when the red list of ecosystem, when your ecosystem or your ecosystem you consider are in the global IUCN red list of ecosystem, which is very rarely the case until now. Another criterion related to ecosystem is geographically restricted ecosystem. It's B4. 20% of the global extent of an ecosystem type, regardless of whether the ecosystem type is globally threatened or not. You remember A2, A or B, it is related to threatened ecosystem, so critically endangered, or vulnerable, so between 5% or 10%. Now, if you have 20% of an ecosystem that exists only in the proposed KBA, it's enough. It doesn't need to be threatened to qualify for KBA. But the problem remains the same. How can you prove that the ecosystem you gave a name or you describe exists only or is the same in other countries, and you have to prove that 20% of this ecosystem exists only in your proposed KBA. And probably it's very, very difficult to prove that. So just at the moment, I don't think it's a very useful criterion, but maybe a bit later on we could use it. Ecological integrity, this is very interesting. A site qualifies as a KBA under criterion C because it is one of the maximum 2 per ecoregion characterized by wholly intact ecological communities. And ecoregions provide the unit of analysis for the assessment of criterion C. So ecoregion for us is the Mediterranean. It should be noted that many ecoregions of the world will not have any remaining areas of the size and ecological integrity required to qualify as a KBA under criterion C. And this is especially the case in the Mediterranean region. I don't think we have any site that is really intact with no interaction with human activities, especially if we take into account the climate change criterion. So everything I told you seems very complicated, and not everything is useful, but it was in order to give you an overview on what exists as criteria for this KBA, for this, yes, globally KBA. The most commonly used criteria for planned KBAs, and these are the one you could use to propose or delineate planned KBAs. It's first, the B1, individually geographically restricted species, so the so-called narrow endemics. So it's all the sites that have more than 10% of global population size and more than 10 reproductive units of any species. But the most important is the 10% of global population size. So each site you have in your country or region that have at least 10% of the global population size of one taxa, so global, or really global at the world scale, qualify for planned KBA. And this is the main criterion we use as botanists to define planned KBA, because with that you can capture all the narrow endemics you have in your region. And it's rather simple to prove that, but be careful. The data must be accurate and recent, not only based on bibliography or old maps and so. The second criterion, which is rather often used, is the threatened species, the E1, with all the 5 sub-criteria I mentioned, I explained you before, so related with the size of the population for critically endangered or endangered species, and the question of past or current decline. But for the threatened species criterion, you must have the species in the global IUCN red list of threatened species. If it is not, you have to prove, you have to make the assessment and submit it to the red list unit. So it's more difficult. If you have narrow endemic, even if they are not threatened, even if they are not in the global red list, or even if they are not in the local or national red list, you can use this B1 criterion. So B1 is not the more important, but the easier to handle at the first step, and after the threatened species. IUCN and the KBA in partnership published guidelines on applying all these criteria. You can download them following this link, and there are many explanations on how to use it, and this could answer to most of your question about how to apply these criteria. So now you have a site, and you have to put it on a map. So delineate it and propose it to qualify for KBA. First, some key definition. What is a site? A site in the KBA for KBA as a definition is a geographical area on land and or in water, or less important for us, with defined ecological, physical, administrative or management boundaries that is actually or potentially manageable as a single unit. The most important word is manageable. And what is manageability? It is the possibility of some type or effective management across the site. A KBA should be a manageable unit, but does not need to be a single management unit. And it's possible to implement action locally to ensure the persistence of the KBA trigger biodiversity elements. There is no minimum or maximum size for a KBA. It's really it could be it could be like a small protected area, a plant micro reserve, but it could be also be larger. It could also be larger, like a national park or whatever. But it has to be to have a management in order to conserve it. So the goal of this KBA initiative is to protect the species and the ecosystem, so to manage them. It's not only an academic approach. And you have always to take into account this question of management. So when you have, there are many explanations in the guidelines how to delineate the sites, and what is the optimum with several species or taxonomic group. After, so you and your group of 4 colleagues, you are an external proposer. You have in mind to propose a planned KBA or a KBA, and you have to propose it to the KBA National Coordination Group. And every country should or will have a national coordination group for KBA. And this is the body that will take into account and receive your proposal and examine it and see if it is well done or not, and propose it after to the KBA regional focal point, because it's not only the country responsibility, but it has to be regionally sound to be accepted. After, there is an external review, and at the end, the KBA Secretariat validates this KBA. In most of the case, so we are botanists, or most of us are botanists, we will propose plant KBA at the National Coordination Group. And after, within this National Coordination Group, they will also examine reptiles KBA, birds KBA, and after they will try to mix or to have a common KBA, which is important for plants, birds, and reptiles, and amphibians, and so on, if possible, because it's not good to have overlapping KBAs. It's better to have one larger KBAs that can be managed for all the species, all the taxonomic group, than several more or less overlapping KBAs. But this is the task of the National Coordination Group. Practically, to propose a KBA, you have to fill a form, an online form with the whole description of the proposed KBA, with the trigger species, the criteria, the rationale, the thresholds, and all the documentation required. It's not very complicated, but you have to fill this form in order that you planned KBA proposal is studied and finally accepted by the national committee and the regional committee. Here also you have, I don't, the purpose today is not to go more in depth on the delineation process. You have guidance in publications that you can also download in order to better understand what's all about. But we are not yet at this stage. So I don't know. I don't know if in which countries exist already KBA National Coordination Group, but I hope it's the case at least in some countries. Probably through the IUCN Secretariat or the IUCN Committee of your country, if it exists, you can have this this information. And here is a procedure to establish a national coordination group. So it's a national coordination group for the global KBA. It's not only for the plant KBA. So many KBAs have already been identified in the MED. You probably all know the KBA mapped in the Mediterranean biodiversity hotspots published in July 2017. Unlike the previous version, there are many plant KBAs or mixed KBAs. You can see more or less in this map, and also another set of this time only plants KBA have been published 2 years ago by IUCN. We defined 150 global plant KBAs in Algeria, Egypt, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Palestine, Syria, and Tunisia. And this was published. You can also download this publication if you don't have it already. So we already have some plant KBA, but it's in the MED, but you always have the possibility to propose new one, because this work, either for CEPF or with IUCN, it was a preliminary work with not many investigation in the field. It was for many countries mainly based on expert knowledge, but it was a rather good success, and we probably captured a good proportion of the main planned KBA for this country. But there are still a lot of work to do, and we encourage you to continue to go on to propose new planned KBA or to adapt the limits of already proposed planned KBA. So I think it's enough for this afternoon for me, and I'm ready to answer to some of your questions if you have any. Thank you.